Okay, I'm honored to be here. It was pulled together with incredible efficiency at the last minute. I was flying back from my position at Groningen in the Netherlands and diverted my flight by way of Amsterdam over then Liverpool, then up here, and then tomorrow I'll go back to my original plans and go back to Philadelphia very early in the morning. Whenever I had my talk prepared for a while, and then someone sent me some material last night, and I was a little curious about it, and it was so upsetting that I ended up taking a lot of time looking at it. And then I had planned this morning to go to the Ulster Museum, and I'd heard about a number of the exhibits there, and I was only able to spend a few minutes because I was still concerned about how it would integrate what I had learned about. And it was about chronic fatigue, ME, but it was also about some troubling issues in terms of social welfare in the school system. And I was particularly alarmed to see that basically a quack treatment was being made available in Northern Ireland. And that parents who were objecting to their children accepting this treatment were being vilified and made to look like vexatious people. And there was an organized campaign of harassment down in London, and I can document all that. And so I shifted around my slides, and I think I don't want to distress people, but I would feel better if I redistributed the distress and help people to recognize there's some issues going on in Northern Ireland that need attention. Now, I often make medical people and mental health professionals uncomfortable because I require disclosures. And the suggestion is that an audience needs to know what might have influenced the person and what they're presenting. And so, notoriously in Scotland, there were some programs to improve parenting, and the idea if parents were in difficulty with their children, there would be mandated referral to those. And I investigated the financial interest of some of the people who were promoting those programs and found there were millions of dollars being made by people in Australia, and they weren't declaring it. And it was quite a turmoil, and ended up with, so far, I've collected 54 apologies, corrections, and errata to articles that didn't report that. And we realized that some of the implementation of policies to improve parenting in Scotland, there was no evidence once you put aside that was conflicted. A film crew came in from the Netherlands, where I have some ties, and based on what they heard interviewing some Scottish physicians, they defunded these parenting programs, not only in the Netherlands, but in the Dutch-speaking parts of Belgium. So my disclosure statement is, I'm paid to be, the money for me to be here is, I think it amounts to 120 pounds that was crowdsourced. But then there's the added issue that I was given a trip up the coast yesterday, and not only was I taken to Bushmills, but I was given one of the people in the room his sample as well as mine. But fortunately, by any normal standards, that is not considered putting me at risk for a conflict of interest, but it's always been my policy to report them and you decide. So what I was doing before this, I was over in Groningen has a worthy opponent, and I dressed up in a robe, and it's very serious business there. And Somalia Mohammadi showed up without her PhD, and she had to face worthy opponents. And in the Netherlands, you actually bring 2 seconds with you, just in case you fall down or something happens to you. I guess in the Middle Ages, sometimes fights would develop in PhD dissertations, and you'd need someone to look after you. But basically what Somalia had to do was to deal with my opposition, and I'd raise politely but challenging questions, and obviously succeeded and survived and got her PhD and has left for Canada to take a postdoctoral position studying chronic pain. And it was all very positive. Now, what's the relevance here? She was willing to debate me. She was willing to accept and what you're going to hear about some of the British academics is they refuse to debate, they refuse to discuss. I'm not a worthy opponent. I'm just vexatious. Some things the British academics know about me. I've published over 350 articles. These are numbers that you probably don't worry about, and I don't either, but they matter to them. I have over 36,000 citations to my work and the H-index of 86. To put that in perspective, at the medical school in Groningen in the Netherlands, I ranked number 5 in the entire medical school, and that's pretty difficult for a psychologist to do. Some people are impressed by that. I'm not. I'm an academic editor at PLOS One. We'll be talking about PLOS One, but that's not really a big deal because we have over 4,000 academic editors, and we turn out 25,000 published papers a year. I'm a promoter of open access. It's the idea that if taxpayer money pays for funding public monies, then the research citizens should not have to pay a fee to access this. It should be available to anyone in the world. And that means also in terms of developing countries, they shouldn't have to have a medical library and an ID at the medical school in order to access stuff. And then I'm promoter of PubMed Commons. It's this new system we've developed in the United States where if anybody's ever published anything at all, even a letter to the editor, if they've got one of the 26 million entries into PubMed, list of all the medical articles, then they have the right to go there and comment on them. And certainly there are a number of patients in the community that have developed very good skills. There's what I call citizen scientists, and they're actively participating in the post-publication review. What does that mean? That after articles are published, they help determine how the article is interpreted. And we're finding that the British academics don't like patients doing that. Patients are to be seen and not heard. And a lot of the struggle around data access is preventing patients who are capable of analyzing it from getting it. And the other issue that comes up a lot with the community is just because you're a patient who sometimes has brain fog, you often are or were a very competent professional and have the skills that the members of the British Academy have, but you're excluded because it's a preemptive identity. If you're a patient, you lose your identity as having been or even currently being a professional. And there's some real issues of hierarchy there. In 2015, I was the Carnegie Centenary visiting professor at Stirling University, and the British academics know that. I'm dyslexic. You see I got the extra S in there. As part of the Carnegie Fellowship, Carnegie encouraged me, the Carnegie Trust encouraged me to go out and give talks for free to universities, to pubs, but they said I was allowed to go to England or to Ireland, but it was not sanctioned. Nonetheless, and so there's a long list of places I did give talks, but because taking advantage of my availability, I was invited to a number of places in England. Two talks at Oxford University. I was invited to the High Table, and I spoke at the Institute of Psychiatry, University of Bath, Bristol, Newcastle, did a pub talk in Birmingham and Hertfordshire University. And I'm bringing that up because I made a lot of friends there. Some of the people who invited me to dinner, invited me to give talks, were now at odds with each other. And I can tell you at High Table, I learned that people who've grown up in that culture certainly have better manners and can wield a knife and fork with greater adeptness than someone from Chelsea, Massachusetts. But when it came down to once you start disagreeing with them, or if you start dealing with pace in a way they don't want, they can get pretty nasty. And it's been a great loss. Some of the friends that who are quite hostile because I spoke out. Yeah. So one of the things they tolerated me, and one of the things they would invite me to give talks, is that I'm a skeptic. And the idea is that when there's a dispute or a controversy, this to be resolved by looking at evidence. And they like the idea that I sometimes look at social policies that were supposedly based on evidence that really weren't. In the United States, for instance, it was decided that the treatment of pain by GPs was neglected. And that's true. So they developed a policy that they would make pain the 5th vital sign, and that every time a patient came in, no matter what their problem was, they'd be asked about their pain. It made sense, but then when the pressures developed for the physicians to do something, there were a lot of unnecessary procedures. There's a lot of knee and back surgery, and there was addiction to prescribed opiates replaced addiction to heroin has a major social problem in the United States around drugs. The idea was well meant, but it wasn't based on data. I looked at some evidence that examined whether assigning a psychiatrist to a dying patient in a hospital in palliative care, was there any improvement over allowing them access to a pastor of their choice? And so basically it was a matter of should we make dying a mental health issue and maybe give it a diagnosis like, I don't know, adjustment reaction related to death. And we looked at the data. Surprisingly, the patients who had the access, free access, not hourly access to a psychiatrist, to a pastoral counselor or a lay counselor, they actually were more satisfied. And there was no greater decrease in depression to those assigned to a psychiatrist. Now, obviously, some patients do need a psychiatrist. They're prone to depression, but surprisingly, end of life is not a period of epidemic of depression, as some of the psychiatrists are. And psychiatrists were uncomfortable with that finding, but they had to accept it was based on the data. And I really had no dog in the fight. I really didn't care. I just wanted to see what the data said. Now, there are some extreme statements that I made when I was in the UK, but I cited some of my current adversaries. So much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. That's a radical statement to say, but the editor of The Lancet, one of arguably the most prestigious medical journal in the UK, made it, not me. I just cited him. But now he is writing to Post magazine, the journal Post, asking that they keep me off social media and stop blogging because I'm being vexatious. He's made a number of very favorable statements about the need for change and the idea that change is occurring as quickly as possible. But the bad news is that nobody's ready to take the first step to clean up the system. I took the first step in requesting the PACE data, and he attacked me. And when patients got involved in asking for data, they were attacked as a rabble that was, first that there was only a minority were raising issues. When the patients recently confronted Richard Horton with 11,400 signatures on a petition suggesting the PACE trial be reevaluated and perhaps retracted, he refused to deal with them because that was an organized effort. So they went from being a small minority to an organized effort, but either way they were ineligible to comment on what was going on. And here's another, arguably one of the best medical journals, prestigious in the world. It's simply no longer possible to believe that much of the clinical research that is published or rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authority guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reach slowly and reluctantly as an editor. So I was making these kinds of statements. They were agreeing with me until I started making them about PACE. I was involved in pushing a lot of reforms, that we should pre-register clinical trials, that we should know what was planned, and so that there couldn't be any outcome switching after the trial was conducted, that there should be more transparent reporting of what went on, there should be full disclosure of investigative conflicts, there should be sharing of data, and greater patient involvement as collaborators in the interpretation and dissemination of results. And none of these things were controversial. They were seen as very innovative. That's why they kept inviting me. I was doing a couple talks a week at one point, flying around the UK. And then I started speaking out. I had also pushed the idea of citizen scientists, that the argument is that consumers of healthcare, and that's all of us, we're bombarded with a lot of unreliable information, and sometimes we could look to authorities, but sometimes we had to have some rules when we should distrust authorities. So recently there was an authoritative paper published in the United States with the scientific director of the National Institute of Aging, and the claim was that if we have a positive attitude towards aging, then we'll develop Alzheimer's later. And if only were that easy. And the idea that attitude towards the old people around you was a modifiable risk factor for you yourself developing Alzheimer's. And when I pointed out that was rubbish and invited the scientific director of NIH to respond to my critique and did get it, my academic friends in the UK applauded that I would be so bold. But then I started speaking out against PACE. And here is Sir Simon Wesley, head of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And we had been talking about how we'd kept missing each other, and we should get together for a beer. We correspond pretty regularly. But once I criticized PACE, I was being rude. And I really don't know why you're so rude on Twitter. I don't think it helped, and it's not you. I love this mind game where I'm not being myself if I'm being critical, and I'm put at risk that I can't have a beer with Simon Wesley because I'm not myself. And maybe when I recover, I get back to the point of having a beer. And what I did is I criticized PACE. And so I've come to the conclusion, it's great sadness that I'm losing a lot of relationships among the British elite, but I'm willing to sacrifice that. If they'll just give me the data. If I'm wrong about the tricks I think they played in the reporting, I'll apologize profusely. I don't think I am, but I think that once I start analyzing the data, I'll be able to reveal some of the real harm that was done to patients in that trial and the real distortion. And I think the longer that they withhold the data from me, the more doubts they are about the quality of what they did. And I think they're losing the battle just by holding out. Some things that British academics don't know about me. I think they think we have more in common. They know that I don't have a relative with chronic fatigue or ME, but they don't know about Davy. That was a dominant factor in my life, that my stepbrother wasn't given a transfusion at birth that he needed. Back then, in 1958, pregnant women with Rh factor had to have transfusions. Now it's a minor issue because you have vaccinations. He had massive brain and liver damage, and he lived like a vegetable for 13 years. And it dominated my family life. My stepfather couldn't handle it and died on a drunk, and so we became a single parents living on welfare in the projects. And it was a profound experience. I learned about stigma. I learned about disrespect for people who are receiving social welfare involuntarily, it was really rough dealing with the outside world. My attractive sister, some wealthy people paid for her dress, so she became the queen of the junior prom. But then Davy started getting calls from jealous teenage girls asking him out on a date just to humiliate her, and this is the sort of thing you put up with. My mother used to do novenas to St. Jude, I guess hopeless causes, because she had involuntarily divorced from my father and then my stepfather. She was excommunicated and couldn't receive communion, but she would go 7 days straight. And her prayer was that Davy would rise up and speak, and that I would sit down and shut up, because I was very outspoken about what was going on in the family where we were mistreated. And I attracted attention of the housing authority, and fortunately the Catholic, the Lay Retreat League intervened, and they got me to work. They got me paid employment in the summers with the housing authority and got them to appreciate. But the minor thing that answered my mother's prayers is there I am, and shows what a good haircut does. What she'd been praying for is I'd give up my, I don't know what you call them here, but the DA, do you call them DAs or Yeah, DAs. And so I cut that off to be in the picture. And, but then the lay Catholic group said that you've got to make something yourself. You get out of the projects, get out of the, and so they encouraged me to apply to the Carnegie Foundation, it's called, the United States. And I ended up getting a financial offer from Carnegie Tech that was only $200 less than my family income for the year. And they would give it to me for 4 years. And so what the British academics don't know is that my coming over 50 years after I got this award was payback for things that I felt so grateful for. But I was coming back not just as an esteemed Carnegie centenary professor, but with somebody with a chip on his shoulder who resents when they see vulnerable people on social welfare mistreated, and vulnerable, feeling that I had something to pay back, not only in accepting the professorship, but in how I dealt with social and scientific issues. My involvement with PACE started off very simply. I was looking at it like other clinical trials, and I was very upset by the contempt that Michael Sharp seemed to be showing, and I announced on Twitter that Michael Sharp quotes are offensive. I'll lay waste to PACE follow-up study by Thursday in a blog post, and that basically set off a war with the academics. First steps I focus on, it's another example of bad science. It's another example of investigators deliberately interpreting results so that favors their pre-existing conclusions. I sought an open dialogue and debate. Naively, I thought that the British academics would invite me down to London the way they had invited me down a month ago, and they wouldn't. They refused to debate, and so I published a critique in Lancet Psychiatry. Basically, there's a lot of bad science going on there. And it's being badly represented by the investigators, and it's being badly represented in terms of what you can do with PACE in terms of social policy. And it was going unchallenged. And it was uncritically passed on by journalists in the media with clear harm to patients. Now, my idea about investigators always have biases, and there needs to be some checks and balances as it filters down into the media and into social policy. And I was amazed that none of those checks and balances seemed to be operating. It seemed to be an unusual situation. But then I noticed that everybody was trying to get the Lancet data, and they were being fended off, but that one of their articles had appeared in the journal that I was an editor on, PLOS One, and in order to publish there, they had to promise that they would make it available upon request. So I filed a routine request. It wasn't through the Freedom of Information Act. It was through as a direct appeal to them as someone to honor their promises they had made in terms of publishing. They didn't have to publish in that journal. I requested the data. They refused, calling me vexatious. And now there's an internationally watched standoff going on with lawyers involved on both sides. I'm not involved. My legal team isn't. PLOS's is, and King's College is. And now it's gone about 90 days. And I think that people are getting restless and want action. And my understanding is that some of the other academic editors at PLOS One, we all work there for free, are considering calling a general strike if PLOS One doesn't either get the data for us, however they can do it, or retract the paper. So it's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks. Once I started getting attacked, I didn't like being attacked, but I started to decide I would deliberately draw it in by speaking back as my strategy is working. Basically, I would draw contempt from British academics, normally reserved for patients considered stupid, and I'd show that stupidity was not the issue. It's just being challenging. And by the objective criteria, I was more qualified to look at the data than any of the members of the PACE investigator team, and they knew that. But when they attacked me in the same way they attacked patients, it became a different issue because they're attacking professionals. It shouldn't be that way. That's got to change. And so why should I ask them? It's their data, isn't it? No, it's not. Publicly funded research is funded because so the larger society can get the data and use it, and can use it efficiently by making it more generally available. British and international rules required data to be available. Now that was involved in all of the patient challenges to PACE, but I introduced a new wild card that I was challenging data they had promised to deliver us. Give it up. And PACE kept saying they couldn't give me the data because it would violate patient rights. The patients didn't know that the data were going to be available. Actually, there's a lot of international rules that suggest if once you anonymize data so they can't individually be identified, those issues are settled. Those are technical issues. That's easily done. But when it came down in violating patient rights, there were some serious violations because in recruiting patients to the studies, they didn't tell patients that they were being paid by insurance companies. They didn't tell people that the study was funded by the department, DWP, yeah, I got to get my British acronyms right, and which had an investment in getting them certain results. And I believed it might potentially influence the willingness of patient, and it's unethical. And I'm not making up that rule, it's part of the Helsinki Declaration, that all investigators have to do that. But worse, they didn't anonymize the data, they stored it in unlocked drawers, and some of it got stolen with the patient's name on it. And that's criminal negligence in the United States. Now, I was really pleased that the patient advisory group that had been working with the investigators rebelled this morning. They were under a lot of pressure to stay out of the fight. And I didn't have anything to do with this, I don't think. But I'm sure if my mother were alive, she'd say, oh dear God, I got to do another novena to St. Jude. Can't you just sit down? You're causing trouble again like you always do. But MoMA, I'm not sure I had anything to do with that, but that's very significant. They were put under enormous pressure. The ME Association had to sign loyalty oaths that they would not criticize the investigators or they'd be thrown off the project. And it's a vague, unenforceable requirement, but it threatened them, and many of them interpreted they could not speak against PACE on Facebook or other social media. And so reluctantly they stayed quiet, they wanted to stay involved, and today they rebelled. I want to make it clear that there is no vexatiousness out there. I know some of the people who made the original demands on behalf of the patients. One of them, Bob Kindlin, I wanted to meet him. He lives in Dublin. And he said, no, you can't do that. I only come out of my darkened room for medical appointments and one vacation a year. But he analyzes data. He does lit reviews for me. He's wonderful. And he's exceptionally polite. He never was impolite. But the impoliteness was that he published papers in peer-reviewed journals that took issue. And so L.M. Mathlis he lives in outside of Sydney. He's the original vexatious requester of the data. And I can come here and challenge Alan and Tom, this one's for you, mates. And I think we're getting somewhere this time because the whole world's watching. And the standing of the PACE investigators is weaker because we're fighting about the PLOS data, not the Lancet data. The bad research practices that make this an outrageously bad trial, Lancet requires that you publish your protocol for your paper before you start collecting. They publish it afterwards, and they manipulated their outcome measures once they peeked at the data. And one of the things they did is they suppressed any objective data which showed that PACE didn't work. So in terms of getting people really fully functioning and back to work, it's not going to happen. But they're hiding the data. And they ignored international and British requirements for sharing data. They relied on discredited diagnostic criteria. I believe that the PACE data will be rejected internationally. Why is that? When people have chronic fatigue ME, they get depressed. Some of them do. Surprisingly, not as many as we'd expect. And so we don't know if we're doing a study that we want to look at affecting ME or chronic fatigue. We want to exclude the depressed people because we're afraid that some of the things that we do will influence the depression and not the ME. And with self-report measures, you can't distinguish that. Furthermore, they poorly match the control group. When you have a control group in a randomized trial, you want to control for expectations, hope, and amount of attention you get from professionals. The patients in the routine care in the PACE trial were pretty neglected and pretty hopeless, as were their GPs, and so any attention at all might be confused with an active ingredient of the CBT. And self-report outcomes are highly susceptible to the presence of depression, anxiety, or lack of appropriate controls. I had done previous research on objective versus subjective measures. I had gotten some special equipment that allowed me to rig up the chest of men who were having hot flashes as a result of being treated for prostate cancer. Men aren't good at reporting they're having a hot flash. They were kind of embarrassed about it. And we showed that the objective measures were totally inconsistent with the self-report. I got attacked from all sides. I didn't understand. That was just a bit of science. It's because some people were invested in doing studies paid by the drug companies with it show that antidepressants improved menopausal symptoms, and they didn't want objective measures interfering with the placebo effect. So I had a hard time getting that published. It's as I said the other day, and I got quoted, I guess, it's a wasteful train wreck of a study. And it's basically investigators with conflicts of interest designing a study virtually assured to produce misleading advice. They tampered with the process, they tampered with the outcomes, and they likely harms to subgroups of patients were obscured. And this is a point that more and more I agree with. The PACE investigators don't care whether or not psychotherapy works for ME and CFS. They know it probably did in their study. What they want to do is claim that therapy is effective so patients can lose their welfare benefits if they're not in therapy. So they may be offering a harmful or ineffective treatment, a treatment that often, that many chronic fatigue and ME patients can't even show up for, but they can say, you've got to show up and you've got to be in therapy, or we're going to cut you off. And it's a way of reducing the large cost of social welfare payments, reducing the rolls. And Michael Sharper said, purchasers and healthcare providers with hard-pressed budgets are understandably reluctant to spend money with patients not going to die, especially when there's a controversy of the reality of the condition. And so that the PACE trial preserves the myth that they basically have a mental health issue and they're resisting treatment if they're not getting it. It doesn't matter if they're benefiting. There's no evidence that objectively PACE can get people back to work or real affects objective outcomes. And so I'll stop there, because I would have gone on, and basically I published a paper in Lancet, and it was an alternative to the debate I wanted to have in public. But then I'll move on to something that really upset me when somebody sent this last night. It was about the SMILE study. How many people have heard of the SMILE study? Anybody? No? Few. Basically, the suggestion is that there's a lightning process that's been developed by Phil Parker, and it can be used for MS, chronic fatigue, almost anything you want, and it comes from integrating osteopathy, life coaching, and NeuroLinguistic Programming. The problem with it is that the trial was unethical, and I'm particularly concerned the treatment's now being offered in Northern Ireland, and there's no evidence, not only that it works, but there's no evidence that the foundations for doing the treatment don't make sense scientifically. And when parents have complained about the lightning process being available, they've been vilified and there's been organized harassment. It's been going on for years, and I'll document that. So I looked it up, and again, he was claiming that, Phil Parker, that he could treat all these conditions, and as a skeptic, training citizen scientist, if it sounds good true, it isn't. But here it is being offered in Northern Ireland. So if you go there and try to find out about it, something weird happens. Well, first, when you survey patients, there's actually considerable harm being done. But so if you go to the video that's on YouTube, you find out that it stops right away. And that's because he was sued by the Advertising Standard Agency adjudication on his videos. They felt that unprovable assertions and improbable assertions were being made, and they had to be cut out of the videos. The only way he escaped criminal prosecution was, he says, I'm not really treating these conditions. I've got advice about them, and that it's training, not treatment. However, it's being implemented in Northern Ireland as treatment, and he's getting paid for it. And they suggested there were absurd claims of 80 to 90% success. Nothing works like that. And it also, there were absurd claims that treated irritable bowel, eating disorders, phobias, self-esteem. It's all misleading. Now, the problem, when you investigate it, is there's a fascinating discredited theory behind it. The theory is NeuroLinguistic Programming. And a journalist went and enrolled in it, and he came back with outrageous statements. You've got a problem? Go see Richard Bandler, the founder of a controversy, multi-billion-dollar therapy and LLP, who'll get inside your head quick. But how did a former cocaine user and murder suspect become a guru to over 30,000 people? And he actually was charged with murder in the United States because at the apartment of a prostitute, his .357 Magnum was found, but they couldn't connect him to having pulled the trigger. And he was a cocaine user, and he has no relevant training, yet he's made a lot of money promoting these things. He's been the object of scorn. Oh, this is some of the things that the journalist found. He would brag about how he punched a man who hit his daughter because she was speaking to his invisible angels, and he motivated a man to clean out his garage by thinking about breast as he picked up the trash. And this guy's a crazy man. And then he managed to smuggle rubber snakes into a schizophrenic shower at the mental hospital to prove he didn't require drugs for sanity, because he would react to the snakes crawling around, live snakes, and they weren't hallucinations. And he basically says, you know, my cure for schizophrenia is to alter the reality, not the hallucinations. A lot of patients with mental issues simply don't have proper strategies. And again, this guy's a wacko, and he's just generally not accepted among mental health professionals in the United States. But the patients who complained about Smile being offered, or the parents who complained about Smile being offered to their children, they were seen as an organized campaign, and they were denounced as just like the people who are anti-vaccination or anti-GMO. They were compared in the newspapers in London as being like the anti-frackers, but then when they found out that fracking was dangerous to the environment, they removed that comparison. And you see in the Sunday magazines, basically these are made up letters that supposedly came from ME and chronic fatigue patients. You evil bastards, we're going to cut your balls off. Stay out of this, time is running out. And then they made Simon Wesley into a hero for facing all these death threats. He said he was studying PTSD in Iraq and going down into the combat zone. It was much safer than going to his office because some ME and chronic fatigue patients might have showed up. Now, the problem with these claims, why didn't he call the police? Why didn't anybody get arrested? But back where it was extended to the Smile trial is Esther Crawley was picked out as a particular sad example of just an honest scientist trying to do her research, being criticized by patients. The issues for the parents and the patients were that her research was not producing the effects it was claimed. Now, like the PACE investigators, she's particularly appealing to social welfare agencies. The notion is if children are refusing to show up for school with medically unrecognized symptoms, they can pressure the parents to make them show up. Or, and they can say to the parents, if you can't get kids to show up, you've got to put your kids in treatment. And if you can't do that, you can be your kids can be sectioned. So basically the threat is that parents can be separated from their children unless they're in this treatment. And the treatment's totally wacko. So I personally think that one of the things that can stop now is that in the Northern Ireland, they look seriously at the provision of this wacko treatment. There's no evidence effective. It's there's no evidence for it, it's not scientifically based. It's incoherent theory that mental health professionals have stopped even talking about 10 years ago because it's so ridiculous. And I think there are plans for another trial of this lightning process. The rationale for the trial that University of Bristol gave, we don't know whether it works, so we better find out. That is not ethical. If we don't have any basis for believing a treatment works, then it's unethical to put kids into it. And parents consent for treatment, but kids have to give the assent. They have to agree to it. And they can't do it if they're misinformed that it's a promising treatment. There's no evidence that it's promising. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.